Donald Trump is clearly not shy about saying he would get revenge on his perceived enemies in a second term. Are we taking his threats seriously enough?
Well, I don't think enough people are. When you hear Trump saying things like people are saying that retribution can be justified, what he really means is I'm saying retribution can be justified. And I think he's got a long list of adversaries he wants to go after. But I think the Justice Department under a Trump administration will be in continuing chaos as he tells his political appointees to go after Mr. X or Ms. Y, whether there are grounds to do it or not. And what those lawyers do will tell you a lot about their legal integrity. But I think it will put the judiciary under real pressure.
You might be on that perceived enemy list. Are you concerned at all for your own safety?
Well, I'm concerned about a lot of people that I think he has made it clear he wants to go after. Look, he tried to suppress my book. He tried to get a criminal investigation started. Both of those have been settled and taken out of the picture because they were utterly without merit. But I don't think those little technicalities stand in Trump's way. He said, for example, he wants to prosecute Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, for daring to have a conversation with his Chinese counterpart in the run-up to January 6th to assure the Chinese that they needn't worry. Trump says that's treason, and he reminded people that the death penalty used to apply. I think he's very serious. He may joke about it a little bit, but this will be a retribution presidency, and I think the Justice Department will be where the rubber meets the road.
You called the New York verdict a fire bell in the night, and you urged your party, the Republican Party, to nominate someone else at the convention. Do you think that that is something that could realistically happen? Is there a group behind the scenes potentially working on this?
Well, I don't think it's realistic, but I do think people ought to have a gut check at least one more time. For most Americans, voting for a convicted felon, I think, is going to be a real obstacle. And you can say all you want that this was a result of political discrimination against Trump. He'll be able to raise the selective prosecution on argument on appeal. But when the case was put in front of 12 regular Americans, New Yorkers like Donald Trump used to be, they found him guilty because I think the facts the prosecution presented were clear. And that is a problem the party will have and could affect Senate candidates, House candidates, gubernatorial candidates. And I think if he's electing the first convicted felon as president of the United States, it's going to cause real damage to the United States and how we're perceived abroad.
Then, given the guilty verdict today for President Biden's son, Hunter Biden, what do you say to those Republicans who claim that Joe Biden has weaponized the Department of Justice and made it his political tool?
Right, and basically shot his son in the process. I mean, it is a conspiracy theory. I can speak as an alumnus of the Department of Justice. You couldn't do in that department what Trump supporters say has been done and not have it leaked to every major media outlet in the country. It is possible to be the victim of selective prosecution and unfairly so, and also be guilty. And I think certainly that's probably true in Trump's case. In Hunter Biden's case, they're not done with him yet. This is the first case. There's going to be an income tax case, and the U.S. Attorney Special Counsel's investigation into Hunter continues. So it's I'd like to see what the impact of this case is on the election. It will have an election impact, even though it's not Joe Biden, it's his son, and see what people think when Trump says, poor Donald Trump. The whole world is against him, apparently against Hunter Biden, too.
Do you think Donald Trump is a threat to democracy? We keep hearing that phrase out there. I want to know if you believe it, and if so, practically, tangibly, what would it look like?
No, I don't think he's a threat to democracy or our system. I think he will cause enormous damage in a second term, and it will be a term of confusion and turmoil. But the idea that Donald Trump is going to overthrow the United States Constitution, overthrow the Republic, that he's an existential threat to democracy, gives him too much credit. I think it's important to state the threat accurately. not to overstate it, not to understate it, but to understand what the nature of the threat is so people who oppose it can combat it more effectively. Overdoing it, I think, gives Trump a break, and that's a mistake.
Well, you've said that Donald Trump doesn't have the brains for dictatorship, even though he has said that he would be a dictator on day one. Does that make him any less dangerous if he's not that smart but still wants to be a dictator?
Well, I think it goes to the point that while Donald Trump has an infinite span of attention when it comes to the greater glory of Donald Trump, his attention span on most other issues is about equal to a fruit fly's. So that his opponents and even some of his supporters who try and move him away from the most dangerous things that he does will have plenty of room to try and step in. I'm not trying to minimize what I see Donald Trump doing. I think what he was doing at the end of his first term is where he will pick up the day he's inaugurated, and it's serious. But when you say the republic itself is going to fall like the Roman Republic fell, really? People think Donald Trump is equal to Julius Caesar? I mean, give me a break.
He might not be, but this time around, he won't have the safety guards of a you and H.R. McMaster. The list goes on. Are you concerned about the people that are in his current orbit and what they're capable of doing and how they could influence him?
Yes, I think any administration in a second term doesn't attract the quality of people it does in the first. It just for the very practical reason the runway in a second term is shorter. Trump will be a lame duck the minute he's sworn in. And he's got a lot of people around him, basically the people who stayed in the government after January the 6th, who are second and third raters at best. I think the bigger danger, though, is that Trump will insist in staffing a second term on personal loyalty to him above all. He's coming up with his decision for his vice presidential nominee. And I think the two questions on the interview form are, number one, do you think the 2020 election was stolen? And number two, if I told you in a similar situation to do what I told Mike Pence to do, would you do it? And unless the answers to both those questions are yes, then that person's not going to be considered for vice president. I think you're going to see something similar in virtually all the key positions. That is a very dangerous circumstance. And to the extent the Senate, Republicans included, take the confirmation process seriously, if they see people who are more loyal to Donald Trump than they are to the Constitution, that alone is grounds to vote against him.
Is there a specific person that's close to him now that you see as highly dangerous that you're worried about?
Well, I wouldn't want to give any of them Academy Awards. I mean, I think there are bright people, including some people in the House and the Senate, who have joined this cult of personality. And the smarter they are, the more dangerous they are.
You are giving us some very serious warnings and things to take seriously. But something that I'm going to say is not that serious is a write-in vote. This election is going to be Joe Biden or Donald Trump. In 2020, you wrote in Dick Cheney. You have said you would do it again. Are you really giving a clear and honest warning if you're willing to do another write-in that won't help anything?
Look, I bought that argument in 2016 when Hillary Clinton ran against Trump, and I voted for Trump in 2016. I mean, Hillary and Bill were a year ahead of me in law school, and I like to say I'd been bird with them a lot longer than the rest of the country. But after working for Trump, obviously I couldn't vote for him, but I didn't vote for Joe Biden in 2020 and won't this year because I don't think he's fit to be president either for different reasons. So when you have two people who don't cross the bar of acceptability, I think it's legitimate to cast a protest vote. I hear a lot of Republicans who told me a year ago they weren't going to vote for Trump, but they look at Biden and they will choose what they consider to be the lesser of two evils. And I hear other Republicans and some Democrats say the opposite. So, you know, it's an unhappy time for America when these are the two people we've nominated, and it will be a bad 4 years for America, whichever of them wins.
Then are these concerns that you have that serious? Writing somebody in who won't win is not serious.
It's a protest vote. If I didn't vote for anybody this time, it would be a protest vote as well. I'm not going to vote for somebody I think is not qualified, not fit for the office. I'm not going to vote for people whose principles I don't agree with.